Hegel's Encyclopaedia Logic. A. First position of thought towards objectivity. Metaphysics. Paragraph 26. The first position is the naive manner of proceeding which, still oblivious to the opposition of thinking within and against itself, contains the belief that through thinking things over the truth comes to be known, and that what the objects truly are is brought before consciousness. In this belief, thinking engages the objects directly, reproduces out of itself the content of sensations and intuitions as a content of thought, and finds satisfaction in the like as the truth. All philosophy in its beginnings, all the sciences, even the daily doings and dealings of consciousness, live in this belief. Paragraph 27. Because it has no consciousness of its opposition, it is possible for this kind of thinking to be both genuine, speculative philosophizing in terms of its content, as well as to dwell in finite thought determinations, that is, the as yet unresolved opposition. Here, in the introduction, the concern can only be to consider this position of thinking with respect to its limitation, and, hence, to take up the latter sort of philosophizing first. In its most determinate and most recent development, this kind of thinking was the metaphysics of the past, the way it was constituted prior to the Kantian philosophy. This metaphysics is something past, however, only in relation to the history of philosophy. Of itself, it is always on hand, and the perspective of the understanding alone on the objects of reason. Closer examination of its manner of proceeding and main content is of interest for this more immediate reason as well. Paragraph 28. This science regarded the thought determinations as the fundamental determinations of things. In virtue of this presupposition, namely that what it is, by being thought, is known in itself, it occupied a higher place than the later critical philosophizing. However, those determinations were taken to be valid per se, in their abstraction, and capable of being predicates of the true. That metaphysics presupposed in general that knowledge of the absolute could take place by attributing predicates to it, and investigated neither the determinations of the understanding with regard to their proper content and value, nor even this form of determining the absolute by means of the attribution of predicates. Predicates such as these are, for example, existence, as in the sentence, God possesses existence, finitude or infinity, as in the question, whether the world is finite or infinite, simple or composite, as in the sentence, the soul is simple, also, the thing is one, a whole, and so on. There is no investigation as to whether such predicates are something true in and of themselves, nor whether the form of judgment is capable of being the form of truth. Addition. The presupposition made by the old metaphysics was that of the naive belief in general that thinking grasps the in-itself of things, that things are what they truly are only insofar as they are thought. Nature and the minds of human beings are a Proteus, constantly transforming itself, and it is a very natural consideration that things, as they present themselves immediately, are not what they are in themselves. The standpoint of the old metaphysics mentioned here is the opposite of what resulted from the critical philosophy. It might well be said that according to this result, human beings have to rely on chaff and husks alone. But if we look more closely at the old metaphysics as far as its way of proceeding is concerned, it should be noted that it did not go beyond thinking in terms of merely understanding. It took up the abstract thought determinations in their immediacy and allowed them to count as predicates of the true. When talking about thinking, one must distinguish finite thinking, thinking in terms of the merely understanding, from thinking that is infinite and rational. The thought determinations as they present themselves in an immediate and isolated way are finite determinations. The true, however, is what is in itself infinite, and it cannot be expressed or brought to consciousness by means of the finite. The expression infinite thought may appear to be eccentric, if one holds on to the notion of recent times according to which thinking is always limited. In itself, however, thinking is in fact essentially infinite. To put it formally, that which comes to an end, that which merely is called finite, and it ceases where it is connected to its other, and is thus limited by the latter. The finite therefore consists in its relation to its other, which is its negation, and presents itself as its boundary. Thinking, however, is with itself, relates to itself, and has itself for its object. In having a thought as my object, I am with myself. I, the thinking, is accordingly infinite, because in thinking it relates itself to an object that is itself. An object is, generally speaking, an other, something negative opposite myself. When thinking thinks itself, it has an object that is also not an object, that is, something sublated, ideal. Thinking as such, in its purity, thus has no barrier within itself. Thinking is finite only when it stops short at limited determinations that count as something ultimate for it. By contrast, infinite or speculative thinking is likewise determined, and yet, as determining and limiting, it in turn sublates this deficiency. Infinity is not to be interpreted as an abstract yonder and ever yonder, as happens in the ordinary way of representing things, but in the simple fashion indicated above. The thinking of the old metaphysics was a finite thinking, for it moved among thought determinations whose boundaries counted for it as something fixed, that was not negated in turn. Thus, for instance, it was asked, does God possess existence, where existence was taken to be something purely positive, something ultimate and magnificent? We will see later, however, that existence is in no way something merely positive, but instead a determination that is too lowly for the idea and not worthy of God. Furthermore, the question was raised about the finitude or infinity of the world. Here, infinity is rigidly set over against finitude, although it is easy to see that when both are opposed to each other, the infinity, which is supposed to be the whole, appears as one side only, and is bounded by the finite. A bounded infinity, however, is itself something merely finite. In the same way it was asked whether the soul is simple or composite. Hence, simplicity counted as an ultimate determination as well, capable of grasping the true. To be simple, however, is a determination just as poor, abstract, and one-sided as that of existence, a determination that we will later see to be itself untrue, to be incapable of grasping the true. The old metaphysics was thus interested in knowing whether predicates of the kind mentioned could be attributed to objects. However, these predicates are limited determinations of the understanding that express only a barrier and not what is true. In this context, it also needs to be specifically noted how its way of proceeding consisted in attributing predicates to the object to be known, such as God, for instance. This, however, represents an external reflection about the object, since the determinations, the predicates, are ready made, in my representation, and attributed to the object in an external manner only. By contrast, true knowledge of an object must be of the sort that the object determines itself out of itself, and does not receive its predicates from outside. Proceeding, then, in the manner of predication, the mind has the feeling of inexhaustibility by means of such predicates. Assuming this standpoint, the Orientals quite correctly call God a multinomial being, or a being with infinitely many names. The mind is satisfied with none of those finite determinations, and thus the Oriental manner of knowing consists in a restless search for such predicates. Now, regarding finite things, it is indeed the case that these must be determined by means of finite predicates, and here the understanding and its activity are in their proper place. The understanding, being itself finite, also knows only the nature of the finite. If, for example, I call an action a theft, it is thereby determined with respect to its essential content, and it is sufficient for the judge to recognize this. In the same way, finite things relate to each other as cause and effect, as force and expression, and when they are grasped in accordance with these determinations, they are known in their terms of finitude. Objects of reason, however, cannot be determined by means of such finite predicates, and the aspiration to do so was the defect of the old metaphysics. Paragraph 29. Predicates such as these represent in and of themselves a limited content, and show themselves to be inadequate to the fullness of the representation of God, nature, spirit, and so forth, and in no way exhaustive. Moreover, by virtue of being predicates of one subject, they are bound up with one another, and yet they are diverse on account of their content. As a result, they are taken up in opposition to one another from the outside. The Orientals sought to overcome the first defect in the determination of God, for instance by means of the many names they attributed to him. At the same time, however, there were supposed to be infinitely many of those names. Paragraph 30. Its objects were totalities, to be sure, which in and of themselves belong to reason, to the thinking of the in itself concrete universal, soul, world, God. Metaphysics, however, took them up from the sphere of representation, laid them down as ready-made given subjects for the application of the determinations of the understanding to them, and possessed in this representation alone the criterion of whether predicates were adequate and sufficient or not. Paragraph 31. The representations of soul, world, God seem at first to offer thinking a firm hold. However, in addition to the fact that the character of particular subjectivity is blended in with them, and that, on account of this, they can have very different meanings, they need first to receive their firm determination through thinking. This is expressed by every sentence, insofar as in it what the subject is, that is, the initial representation, is supposed to be indicated first by the predicate, that is, in philosophy by means of the thought determination. In the sentence, God is eternal, etc., we start with a representation of God, but what he is not yet known. The predicate first declares what he is. In the sphere of the logical, where the content is determined exclusively within the form of thought, it would therefore not only be redundant to make these determinations into predicates of sentences whose subject would be God, or more vaguely, the absolute. It would also have the disadvantage of taking us back to a standard other than the nature of thought itself. The form of the sentence, or more precisely, of the judgment, is in any case unsuitable to express that which is concrete and speculative, and the true is concrete. The judgment is one-sided on account of its form, and to that extent, false. Addition. This kind of metaphysics was not a free and objective thinking, since it did not allow the object to determine itself freely out of itself, but presupposed it as something ready-made. As concerns thinking freely, Greek philosophy thought freely, but not scholasticism, since the latter likewise took up its content as something given, as, indeed, given by the Church. We moderns, through our entire way of education, have been initiated into representations of things, which it is exceptionally difficult to overcome, because these representations possess the deepest content. Regarding the ancient philosophers, we must imagine human beings who stand entirely within sensory perception, and have no other presupposition than the heaven above and the earth around them, since mythological representations had been discarded. In this factual environment, thought is free and withdrawn into itself, free from anything material, purely with itself. This kind of being, purely with itself, is inherent in free thought, sailing off into the free, open space, where there is nothing below or above us, and where we stand in solitude with ourselves. Paragraph 32. This metaphysics became dogmatism because, due to the nature of the finite determinations, it had to assume that of two opposite assertions, which is what those sentences were, one had to be true, while the other false. Addition. Dogmatism has its opposite at first in skepticism. The ancient skeptics generally called every philosophy dogmatic to the extent that it set up definite doctrines. In this wider sense, genuinely speculative philosophy also counts as dogmatic for skepticism. The dogmatic element in the narrower sense, however, consisting in holding on to one-sided determinations of the understanding to the exclusion of their opposites. This is in general the strict either-or, and accordingly it is said, for instance, that the world is either finite or infinite, but only one of the two. By contrast, the true, speculative, is precisely what does not possess such a one-sided determination, and is not exhausted by it, but rather unites within itself as a totality those determinations that for dogmatism count as something fixed and true in their separation. It frequently happens in philosophy that what is one-sided puts itself up alongside the totality with a claim to be something particular, something fixed opposite it. In fact, however, what is one-sided is not something fixed and obtaining for itself, but is instead contained as something sublated in the whole. The dogmatism of the metaphysics of the understanding consists in holding on to one-sided thought determinations in their isolation, whereas the idealism of the speculative philosophy, by contrast, has the principle of totality and shows itself to reach beyond the one-sidedness of the abstract determinations of the understanding. Thus, idealism will say the soul is neither wholly finite nor wholly infinite. Instead, it is essentially the one as well as the other, and thus neither the one nor the other. That is to say, such determinations in their isolation are invalid, and they are valid only qua sublated. Even in our ordinary consciousness, this idealism already occurs. Thus we say of sensory things that they are changeable, that is, both being and not being accrue to them. We are more stubborn when it comes to the determinations of the understanding. These, taken as thought determinations, count as something more rigid and fixed, indeed, something absolutely rigid and fixed. We regard them as if they were separated from each other by an infinite abyss, so that the determinations standing opposite one another are incapable of ever reaching each other. Reason's battle consists in overcoming what the understanding has rendered rigid. Paragraph 33. In its well-ordered form, the first part of this metaphysics was constituted by ontology, that is, the doctrine of the abstract determinations of essence. Due to their multiplicity and finite validity, a principle was lacking for these determinations. For this reason, they had to be enumerated empirically and contingently, and their more precise content can be based only on the representation, on the assurance that in thinking one associates precisely this particular content with a given word, or perhaps on etymology as well. In all this, it can be a matter merely of the correctness of the analysis, agreeing with linguistic usage, and of empirical completeness, not the truth and the necessity of such determinations in and of themselves. The question whether being, existence, or finitude, simplicity, compositeness, and so on, are in and of themselves true concepts, must seem odd to someone who believes that there can be talk only of the truth of a sentence, that the only question can be whether a concept is being truthfully attributed, as it is called, to a subject or not, and that untruth depended on the contradiction that might be found to exist between the subject of the representation and the concept to be predicated of it. But the concept as something concrete, and even every determinacy in general, is essentially in itself a unity of diverse determinations. Hence, if truth were nothing more than the lack of contradiction, the first thing that would have to be considered for every concept is whether it did not of itself contain such an internal contradiction. Paragraph 34. The second part was rational psychology, or pneumatology, which concerns the metaphysical nature of the soul, that is, of spirit taken as a thing. Immortality was located in the sphere where composition, time, qualitative alteration, quantitative increase or decrease have their place. Addition. Psychology was called rational by contrast with the empirical examination of the outward expressions of the soul. Rational psychology considered the soul according to its metaphysical nature, as the latter is determined by abstract thinking. It wanted to know the soul's inner nature, as it is in itself, as it is for thought. Nowadays, there is little talk about the soul in philosophy, and instead, first and foremost, about spirit. Spirit distinguishes itself from the soul, which is, so to speak, the middle between corporeality and spirit, or the bond between the two. Spirit is immersed in corporeality qua soul, and the soul is the animating principle of the body. The old metaphysics considered the soul as a thing. Thing, however, is a very ambiguous expression. By thing we understand first of all an immediate concrete existence, something of which we form a sensory representation, and the soul has been talked about in this sense. Accordingly, it was asked where the soul has its seat. However, by having a seat, the soul is in space and represented in a sensory way. When it is asked whether the soul is simple or complex, then this is likewise a case of construing the soul as a thing. This question was of particular interest in connection with the immortality of the soul, insofar as the latter was considered to be dependent on the simplicity of the soul. And yet, abstract simplicity is in fact a determination that corresponds to the nature of the soul as little as that of complexity does. As far as the relationship between rational and empirical psychology is concerned, the former takes precedence over the latter, insofar as it sets itself the task of knowing the spirit through thinking, and also of proving what is then thought, while empirical psychology takes its point of departure from sense perception, and only lists and describes what the latter presents with it. But when one wants to think about spirit, one must not be so diffident with regard to its particularities. Spirit is activity in the sense in which already the scholastics said of God that he is absolute. Pure act. But for spirit to be active implies that it express itself. Spirit must therefore not be regarded as an ons, devoid of movement, as happened in the old metaphysics, which separated the interiority of spirit, devoid of movement, from its externality. Spirit must be viewed, essentially, in its concrete actuality, in its energy, and in such a way that its expressions are recognized as determined by its interiority. Paragraph 35. The third part, Cosmology, dealt with the world, its contingency, necessity, eternity, limitedness in space and time, the formal laws and their modifications, as well as human freedom and the origin of evil. The following count, above all, as absolute opposites: contingency and necessity, external and internal necessity, efficient and final causes, or causality in general, and purpose, essence or substance and appearance, form and matter, freedom and necessity, happiness and pain, good and evil. Addition. Cosmology made both nature and spirit, in their external complexities, in their appearance or generally existence, the epitome of the finite, its object. It did not, however, consider its object as a concrete whole, but only in terms of abstract determinations. Thus, for instance, it treated the question of whether contingency or necessity reigns in the world, and the question of whether the world is eternal or created. Next, the establishment of so-called universal cosmological laws, such as, for example, that there are no leaps in nature, formed a main interest of this discipline. Leap here simply means qualitative difference and quantitative change, which appear to be unmediated, whereas the gradual quantitative change presents itself, by contrast, as something mediated. In relation to spirit as it appears in the world, it was preeminently questions concerning human freedom and the origin of evil that were treated in cosmology, and indeed these are questions of the utmost interest. However, in order to answer them in a satisfactory way, it is above all required that one not cling to the abstract determinations of the understanding as something ultimate, in the sense as if each of the determinations in opposition to each other obtained on their own, and were to be regarded as something substantial and true in their isolation. This was, however, the standpoint of the old metaphysics in general, as well as in the cosmological discussions, which for that reason were unable to do justice to their goal of comprehending the appearances of the world. Thus, for instance, the difference between freedom and necessity was drawn into consideration, and these determinations were applied to nature and spirit in such a way that one considered the former in its effects to be subject to necessity, but the latter to be free. This difference is indeed essential, and is grounded in the innermost dimension of spirit. Yet freedom and necessity, as standing abstractly opposed to each other, pertain to finitude alone, and are valid only on its soil. A freedom which did not have any necessity within itself, and a mere necessity devoid of freedom, these are abstract and accordingly untrue determinations. Freedom is essentially concrete, determined in itself in an eternal manner, and thus equally necessary. When speaking of necessity, one tends at first to understand by it only determinacy from outside, as in finite mechanics, for instance, where a body moves only when it is struck by another body, and in the direction imparted to it by this collision. This, however, represents a merely external necessity, not the genuinely inner necessity, for the latter is freedom. It is the same with the opposition of good and evil, this opposition of the modern world immersed in itself. When we consider evil as something fixed, existing for itself, that is not the good, then this is correct and the opposition is to be acknowledged, insofar as its spuriousness and relativity must not be taken to mean that evil and good are one in the absolute, as has apparently been said recently, and that something becomes evil only by virtue of our perspective. What is wrong with this, however, is that one considers evil as something positive in a fixed sense, whereas evil is the negative that has no subsistence for itself, but instead only wants to be for itself, and is in fact merely the absolute semblance of negativity within itself. Paragraph 36. The fourth part, natural or rational theology, considered the concept of God or his possibility, the proofs of his existence and his properties. A. In this kind of consideration guided by the understanding, all depends primarily on which predicates are suitable or unsuitable with respect to how we represent God to ourselves. Here, the opposition between reality and negation is taken to be absolute here. Hence, in the end, there is nothing left for the concept, as the understanding takes it, but the empty abstraction of the indeterminate essence, that is, the pure reality or positivity, the dead product of modern enlightenment. B. The activity of proving propositions as carried out by the finite understanding shows generally the wrong-headed approach in which an objective ground is supposed to be given of God's being, which thus presents itself as something mediated by another. This process of constructing proofs, which takes the identity of the understanding as its yardstick, is caught up in the difficulty of making the transition from the finite to the infinite. As a result, it is either unable to free God from the unremittingly positive finitude of the existing world, such that he had to determine himself as its immediate substance, pantheism, or God remains an object over against the subject and thus something finite, dualism. C. The properties that were, after all, supposed to be determinate and diverse have actually perished in the abstract concept of the pure reality, the indeterminate essence. And yet, insofar as the finite world continues to be represented as a true being and God over against it, there arises the representation of diverse relationships between the two, which, when determined as properties, on the one hand must be, as relationships to finite states of affairs, of a finite nature themselves, such as just, benevolent, powerful, wise, etc., while on the other hand they are supposed at the same time to be infinite. From this standpoint, the said contradiction permits only a nebulous resolution by means of quantitative augmentation or the sensus eminentorium, driving the properties into indeterminacy. In this way, however, the property is in fact annihilated and left with a mere name. Addition. In this part of the old metaphysics, the point was to find out how far reason was able to advance on its own in acquiring knowledge of God. Now, to come to know God by means of reason is certainly the highest task of science. To begin with, religion contains representations of God. These representations, as they are put together in the creed, are communicated to us from our youth onwards as the doctrines of religion. And insofar as the individual believes in these doctrines, and insofar as they are truth for him, he possesses what he needs as a Christian. Theology, however, is the science of this faith. If theology offers merely an external list and compilation of religious doctrines, then it is not yet science. Nor does theology achieve a scientific character through merely historical treatment of its subject matter, as is so popular today, when, for instance, it is related what this or that church father had to say. Achieving this scientific character takes place only by advancing to thinking that comprehends the matter, which is the business of philosophy. True theology is thus, in essence, also philosophy of religion, and this it used to be in the Middle Ages as well. As far as the rational theology of the old metaphysics is concerned, it was not a science of reason, but of the understanding dealing with God, and its thinking moved among abstract thought determinations alone. Insofar as the concept of God was treated here, it was the representation of God that formed the yardstick of knowledge. Thinking, however, must move freely within itself, although it should be remarked straight away that the result of freely thinking coincides with the content of the Christian religion, since the latter is the revelation of reason. Such an accord, however, did not come about in the case of that rational theology. Insofar as it undertook to determine the representation of God by means of thought, the result was only the abstraction of a positivity or reality in general, serving as the concept of God, with the exclusion of negativity, and God was correspondingly defined as the most real being. Now, it can be easily seen, however, that this most real being, by having negation excluded from it, is exactly the opposite of what it is supposed to be, and what the understanding means to have in it. Instead of being the richest and utterly complete being, it is rather the poorest and utterly empty, because of the abstract manner in which it is construed. The mind rightfully demands a concrete content. Such a content, however, is present only if it contains determinacy, that is, negation within itself. If the concept of God is construed only in the sense of an abstract or supremely real being, God becomes for us thereby a mere beyond. There can be no further question of knowledge of him. For where there is no determinateness, knowledge is also not possible. Pure light equals pure darkness. The second point of interest in this rational theology concerned the proofs of the existence of God. The chief point here is that, in the way of construing proofs as it is undertaken by the understanding, concerns the dependency of one determination on another. With this kind of demonstration, one makes a presupposition, something fixed, from which something else follows. So what is being demonstrated here is the dependency of a determination on a presupposition. Now, if the existence of God is supposed to be demonstrated in this way, then this means that the being of God is made to depend on other determinations, so that the latter constitute the ground of God's being. Here one sees immediately that something out of kilter is bound to result, for God is supposed to be the ground absolutely of everything, and therefore not dependent on something else. In connection with this point, it has been said in more recent times that the existence of God cannot be proved, but it must be known immediately. Reason, however, understands by proof something quite different from what the understanding and common sense do. To be sure, the manner of proving engaged in by reason equally takes something other than God for its point of departure, and yet in its progression it does not leave this other standing as something immediate and as a being. Rather, by exhibiting this other as something mediated and posited, it leads at the same time to the result that God is to be regarded as that which is truly immediate, primordial, and self-subsistent, containing mediation as sublated within himself. When one says, "Look at nature, it will guide you towards God. You will find an absolute final purpose." This does not mean that God is something mediated, but only that we progress from an other to God in such a way that God as the consequence is at the same time the absolute ground of the former. Hence, the position is reversed, and what appeared as a consequence shows itself equally as a ground, and what presented itself at first as a ground is demoted to a consequence. This is just the path of proofs conducted by reason too. Following our discussion so far, let us have a look at the procedure of this metaphysics in general. It turns out that it consisted in transforming the objects of reason into abstract, finite determinations of the understanding, and in making abstract identity into a principle. This infinitude of the understanding, however, this pure essence, is itself merely something finite, since the particularity is excluded from it and limits and negates it. Instead of arriving at a concrete identity, this metaphysics insisted on abstract identity. And yet, its good side lay in the consciousness that thought alone represents the essentiality of what is. Earlier philosophers, and notably the scholastics, provided the material for this metaphysics. In speculative philosophy, it is true, the understanding is a moment, but a moment at which we do not stop. Plato is not this kind of metaphysician, and Aristotle even less so. although it is usually believed that the opposite is the case.